All right, I think we'll start. Thank you all for coming. It's really nice to see you all and so many faces of friends who have come to many of these events. And I would like to say it has been a lot of fun to do this whole series. This is number 38 of our conversations that we started a year and a half ago. I'm Dietrich Neumann. I'm the director of the John Nicholas Brown Center for another 3 weeks or so, and I'm also, of course, as many of you know, a professor here at Brown teaching architectural history, and I was very much involved in public art at Brown for many years. And so I wanted to take this opportunity to say a few words of thanks and also to reflect a little bit on this topic of public humanities, which is, of course, the title of this institution. And there are a few changes coming that I want to report on, and I wanted to think a little bit about what it has meant and what it might mean in the future, and then show you a few of my favorite examples of public art. So I expect we'll be here for about half an hour, and then we'll do our usual Q&A and a little bit of wine and food, as we always do. So thank you all for being here. As I said, leading this series has been a lot of fun. I just realized that I look very similar to this photo, which is, of course, a year or so old. I think it was in some event in Berlin last year where I spoke on Mies van der Rohe. But here we go. I'll just maybe start with those changes that I mentioned to you. We have a sister organization in Hong Kong, at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and it's Institute for Cultural Management, and they very kindly invited me to teach 2 classes there, so I'm very excited that Vivian and I will spend a lot of time in Hong Kong in the coming semester. And I've already asked John here for some recommendations, and he swears that the food is extraordinarily exciting and interesting, and so we really look greatly forward to it. And then I have a sabbatical for a year, and so I'll be out of commission for a while. But I must say, being here and seeing many of you every week has really been a tremendous pleasure and a great highlight of my time, and I'm just so delighted to see many of you again. The other change that is coming is, of course, I'm stepping down as director, and Steve Lubar is stepping in as director for 1 semester, and then the administration has exciting new plans for this building. They want to turn the building into a Institute for Advanced Study, modeled on Princeton and Stanford, in the very typical Brown fashion, an Institute for Advanced Study for the common good. So they will invite young scholars to spend a year here or a semester from all fields of knowledge and do something that is meaningful and then report to it to the public. That's sort of what I think is happening to the building. It's still sort of being worked out. And the other question, of course, is what is happening to public humanities, that great program that Steve Lubar, who is here, and I'm grateful that you're here, of course, who has become a really good friend and mentor to me, started 20 years ago. And in some ways, it's so wonderful that he's back now and bringing that ship into the harbor in the final semester. And then Kevin McLaughlin will become the new director for this Institute for Advanced Study. What's happening to the program is, as far as we can tell, that it will migrate to another place on campus. It won't be here anymore, but it will be connected either to the Brown Arts Institute or to the Center of Slavery and Justice in America. So we'll have another anchor, but this needs to be organized, and that will take a moment, of course, to fund and work out. But it's, I think it's not dead. It's, you know, everyone knows this is the moment of public humanities where a lot of funding is available and needed, and a sort of real recognition that this was an amazing idea, maybe of the 1980s, but it you know, has changed and grown over time, but it's a very important idea. And I must admit, when I heard first about public humanities, I think probably when Steve Lubar came here and started this program, I was thinking, what does that actually mean? You know, are there private humanities too? You know, how does that actually work? You know, but now I'm fully convinced that it's a really necessary and wonderful concept. Steve, as I said, he founded this program really almost exactly 20 years ago. And I'm glad actually you came, because I have you here on the screen. And And among the many things that Steve has done in this program and will continue to do, of course, in the coming semester is write this wonderful book, which is one of my favorite books. It's called Inside the Lost Museum, and it's about, or the anchor of this book is this wonderful Brown professor who had a museum up in what is now Rhode Island Hall, and the tragedy of him dying in the line of duty on the steps of this wonderful Natural History Museum. And Steve uses that, comes back to that in sort of wonderful, insightful fashion, and thinks about museums. And I think this sort of emphasis on museums for public humanities was very much at the center of Steve's vision here. The idea, of course, of bringing ideas to the public from the university and having the university learn from the public was something that perhaps emerged from the sort of so-called culture wars in the 1980s. And there are many other terms. I looked around when I wrote our strategic plan of what I could find, and I noticed, apart from public humanities emerging in the 1980s, there were terms like collaborative humanities, comparative humanities, engaged humanities, global humanities, not to mention cross-cultural, multicultural, and countercultural humanities. But there was also, on the other hand, public archaeology, public history, public anthropology, public philosophy, public art history, public architectural history, as well as inclusive collaborative history and many others. So there was clearly a perceived need that the academy had to reach out and bring what we do here to the public. And I think that's a very, very good point. And Steve was really active in that field. He then stepped down after 10 years in the lead, and Susan Smulyan took over, also a wonderful colleague and friend, and she published a book called Doing Public Humanities. She had a sort of slightly different approach, but all valid and I think very useful. She wrote that public humanities practice is a practice that encourages social justice and explores the intersectionalities of race, class, gender, and sexualities. But it was also about bringing what is learned and made and produced here to the public. I can't really claim that I got a book out of this, but I must say I had just as much fun with all our meetings here, and of course engaging with our wonderful MA students. We've traveled together a few times, and really I learned a lot from them, and I've really made an effort in opening up this wonderful house, the old house of the Brown family, to the public, inviting many different groups into it, and I think that at least gave me a lot of fun and satisfaction. But I wanted to just for a moment talk about this notion, which is really at the center of these debates, of how we can engage with the public with things that come out of the academy. And before I move a little further, I wanted to point out that one of the places of activity here is, of course, a place where we have little exhibitions, the tiny exhibits here on behind this wall, which is worth seeing. And we have a gallery that the students create exhibitions for, such as the one that was just opened, Tracy Picard's amazing In the Absence of, a collective biography through speculative archaeology. Tracy, obviously a member of the current cohort with whom I've interacted a lot. And I think the key thing is really that this goal of public humanities is to avoid the sort of proverbial ivory tower, meaning that we produce things here in the university that are only consumed by others in the university and not by the general public, and that we miss out on these great opportunities of learning from the general public. One of our great alumni, Robin Schroeder, has talked very carefully and eloquently about this need for engagement with public and the what she calls the sort of shared authority. Who owns knowledge? How do we share knowledge with others? How can we learn from groups outside of the academy? And that, of course, is very, very important. I wanted to, as a historian, I couldn't maybe be content with the idea that this started in the 1980s. And I began researching a little bit now, just for 5 minutes or so, share with you what I found. I believe public humanities go back into the 19th century. The idea that the university has to reach out from its privileged perch and engage with the public and do something for the public good and take the knowledge gained from the public back to the university. And these are my three heroes that I found in researching this question. Arnold Toynbee, who was a young British historian and economist, and he was convinced that at Oxford, and he was convinced that the university had an obligation, in fact, to be charitable, to reach out to the underserved classes in the south of London and to bring university knowledge to them. And so in honor, he died very young, in honor of him, friends of his created Toynbee Hall, and that really strove to bridge the gap between people of all social and financial backgrounds with a focus on working towards a future without poverty. And they brought university fellows from Oxford to this house in South London in the middle of the working class district, invited people in, taught them classes, engaged with them, brought in health services, helped them to become literate, organize lawyers for them, whatever was needed. And it was really quite wonderful, had an enormous impact. In fact, it's the first of what is called a worldwide settlement movement of bringing university-affiliated institutions in poor areas in cities and doing good work there. And one woman who came to this institution was, in fact, Jane Addams from Chicago. And she was so impressed by seeing this that she started her own Hull House in Chicago. She, in fact, said when she had been to Toynbee Hall in 1887, she said it was a community of university men who live there, have their recreation clubs and society, all among the poor people, yet in the same style in which they would live in their own circle. It is so free of professional doing good, so unaffectedly sincere, and so productive of good results in its classes and libraries, seem perfectly ideal. And then she started her own settlement house, Hull House in Chicago, as a center for research, for analysis, bringing strategies from university scholars to understanding poor parts of the city of Chicago and investigating and documenting things that needed to be improved, be it housing or tuberculosis, typhoid, garbage collection, et cetera, and they supported labor unions and the suffrage movement and provided medical treatment for poor families, but also art classes and night school for adults, a public kitchen, music school, continuing education, et cetera, et cetera. Wonderful institution. Many of you have heard of Hull House, of course, and it goes back to Toynbee Hall and really was meant to teach people with the help of university input to think independently and, in fact, unlock the diversity of the city through collective interaction. Quite beautiful. And then in another chain, to my last great hero is W.E.B. Du Bois, who, in fact, was a friend of Jane Addams, worked at Hull House for a while and then had an amazing career. He is African-American, was the first one to graduate from Harvard with a PhD, then became professor of history, sociology, and economics in Atlanta, founded the NAACP, and was a brilliant communicator. He also was very interested in urban sociology and data collection, so he measured the amounts of poverty, measured the sort of racial mix in parts of Chicago, and then again in Philadelphia, wrote books about it. And he was, in a way, a brilliant communicator and graphic designer. These are graphs that he exhibited at a stand at the World's Fair in Paris in 1900 to show the wealth distribution, the historical plight of African Americans, and make their sort of successes and, of course, solvable problems more visible through these amazing graphs that look like early Bauhaus to me, but it's 1900, and there are hundreds of them, and he was successful, in fact, in interesting the general public in the plight of African Americans in the United States. Absolutely brilliant man. And so I think he too is a great example of public humanities, as are Toynbee and Addams and many others. So it is a phenomenon that goes back to the 19th century and I think has all the potential of continuing on into the future. There's something really important there. I wanted to shift gears now and just show you a few public artworks that we've discussed in class and that we've been interested in, because I feel at the heart of public humanities here, at least, has been public art. Art that's not in a museum, but art that you encounter when you walk the streets, and ideally art that is not simply beautiful, but has a message and a meaning, reminds you of the historical plight of, for instance, the Irish people during the horrendous famine in the mid-19th century, due to a little bug that ate all the potatoes and led to terrible hardship over there. And many people came, and we went as a group. The whole cohort went to New York for a public art weekend and started with Brian Tolley, the designer of the Irish Hunger Memorial in downtown Manhattan. Has anyone seen that? It's one of the most curious works of public art, and I'm still, students know that, I'm still a little divided about what I'm thinking about it, because this is, obviously quite magical. It's like a flying carpet in the middle of downtown Manhattan, and it has transported a piece of Ireland, actually stone by stone it turns out, it was not cheap, from Ireland into New York City. Here we are with the designer, and he brought a whole abandoned house, which was of course a result of the famine that people left by the millions to the United States and elsewhere because they were dying of hunger, and the British government was extremely unsympathetic to their plight. And so he transported this abandoned house, built it on this concrete platform. There's a path coming through it, and then you can go higher up. And he explained everything, how everything that you saw there, even every stone had been brought from Ireland. And then you go up, here's the bit of the house, and then there's a little bit of an outlook at the top where you were supposed to see the Statue of Liberty, but it's now obscured by some trees and a building. And I kind of liked the idea, but there was also something beautifully magical about it that I think was somewhat contradictory to the idea of a memorial to the famine. It seemed like a piece of Ireland had been brought there, which was magical, including that abandoned house. But what did that tell us about the reasons for the famine and the result of the migration, these sort of families that were torn apart? I've missed a little bit the information and the beauty of the whole thing, so almost overpassed the hoped for impact. But it reminded me, of course, of the fact that migration is an ongoing enormous problem, and hundreds of thousands of people are constantly fleeing from poverty, from oppression, from military intervention, from threats to their lives in countries, and try and reach better shores. And so I thought I wanted to look at a few more memorials to migration that are meant to remind us of the plight of hundreds of thousands of people who are on the road as we speak, and many, of course, die in the course. And I wanted to just remind you, we have a family memorial down the hill here in Rhode Island, and while it is obviously not as adventurous formally, it's quite conventional, as you can see here. The text is worth reading, and that is one of the most powerful things I've ever read. It's so outspoken and really lays out the historical facts in a very clear and unsparing fashion. So as I said, quite conventional in its layout, but as a memorial, perhaps it even works better because it really taught me something that I didn't quite know. But I wanted to quickly move on to Italy, and of course the migration across the Mediterranean is one that we often are reminded of. This was just installed, also quite conventional. A Canadian sculptor, Timothy Schmaltz, made a sculpture of people fleeing across in a boat across the Mediterranean. Angels unawares, it's called. There are two wings coming out of these somewhat historical looking figures of leaving a country. Here's obviously someone fleeing from a pogrom, maybe in Germany or Eastern Europe. Orthodox Jew and family, is a pregnant woman here in the foreground, and the Pope blessed it just a few weeks ago when it was installed on the day that is held every year to commemorate the plight of migrants and people fleeing their country. And I wanted to just remind you that, in fact, there are many ways, and often ephemeral ways, of creating wonderful public art. And this is, of course, the Avenue Concepts installation just a few nights ago when they lit up all the public artwork. And this is by Andrew Lam, whose family fled, were migrants from Cambodia to escape the Khmer Rouge. And he sort of commemorated that on a trip back there where he encountered this little girl who reminded him of his family's plight, and he created this beautiful mural, which is really a memorial as well. And here's little Amal. Has anyone come across that? This is a memorial that constantly moves, and I think this is really quite wonderful and quite fantastic. It's a memorial that was created to remind us of the plight of people fleeing the unrest in northern Africa and the countries around the Mediterranean, crossing the boat or wandering through Europe. And she's a 11-foot tall puppet that's operated by people, and she's meant to be a little Syrian refugee girl, and she has had hundreds and hundreds of events. She's traveled thousands of miles and met with the Pope and met with many others. And the designer is a man called Amir Nizar Zouabi, who is Palestinian, and he created this wonderful figure that always creates a spectacle when she shows up. Here, I think I have a short clip that I want to run. Here she is in the streets of New York only weeks ago. And so she obviously creates a spectacle. There's a person inside who walks on stilts, and there are people operating her hands, and she greets people, and there are events that talk about the plight of people fleeing. And it's a wonderful memorial, but it's also an installation and a wonderful work of public art, which I think can be quite successful. Again, of course, one wants to make sure that the beautiful aesthetics of this don't distract from the central message. But as the designer said, the story of refugees is so important for the whole world. Many countries are on the move because of conflict, climate change, farmers that can't work anymore through lack of rain. It's the big story of our time. Because it's an outdoor event, the walk, they call it the walk, has the potential of bringing people together again. At the moment when theaters are struggling to reopen, this is something everyone can be part of. And he continued, the purpose of the walk is to highlight the potential of the refugee, not just their dire circumstances. So it's meant to have also an uplifting, positive message, and it's really quite wonderful, I think, and a really interesting work of public art that is not moving, that is ephemeral, and very, very impactful. So I wanted to mention other memorials and projects might not even have to be built. This I found online. It's a French firm. It's called 1 Week, and they did the research and realized that for the Soccer World Championship in Qatar, the stadia, as many of you know, were built by migrants who came from Pakistan, from India, and many died. Not just falling from a scaffolding, those were maybe 38 or something, but many died due to the circumstances that were the result of this migration that they, of course, undertook to make a better living. And the number, if you take everybody into account who lost their lives in the build-up to this World Cup, which, of course, I'm interested in because I'm German and I love soccer, but that's a whole different story. But the number comes to about 6,500. And this architectural office said, why don't we imagine a building? Qatar has great skyline, of course, has all these Gulf state cities. Why don't we imagine a building with a big block of concrete and a staircase for every one of those lost workers? And they started designing it, and at first there were a few hundred, and then there were a few more, and then over the years building up to the World Cup, in fact, this structure that they designed quite carefully had to be imagined as an enormous tower shooting through the clouds, taller than any tower in the Qatar skyline. And so here's the French studio. It's quite a wonderful idea and memorable to put numbers into forms that stick in our memory once we've seen them. So I wanted to share that with you. It's a memorial that only exists online, right? There's no model, there's nothing that you can go to, but the power of images in their ephemeral quality is, of course, part of what makes memorials successful, not the necessary encounter, but a powerful image to remember. And so many of these memorials, of course, are temporary. Here, for instance, is a British Guyanese artist, Jason de Caires Taylor, who created what he called the Lampedusa, Vic Muniz rather, and he in fact created this little boat which is out of wood but looks as if it's out of paper and out of a newspaper that describes one of those horrible accidents of sinking boats in the Mediterranean where hundreds, centinaia di morti, hundreds of migrants have died, and really, really interesting. It's important, of course, to see that some people felt that perhaps it was not strong enough. It was too sort of cute. It was moving there in the lagoon of Venice, but wasn't impactful enough to, in fact, raise awareness further. And so that's just one of many. Here's Lucy Wood, who took one of the boats where people have arrived in Lampedusa, this Italian island that has seen a lot of immigrants from northern Africa, and traveled in that boat herself all the way back to England and recorded what she experienced there. Here's the Jason de Caires Taylor, who did in fact the raft of Lampedusa, where he created a raft and a boat with full of migrants and sunk it in front of the coast, where divers sometimes go down, and placed it on the bottom of the ocean, this sort of dinghy cast. And one of the figures, the one at the very end there on the left, is someone we know, Abdel Kader, who was a 29-year-old refugee from the Western Sahara who traveled alone on a sinking boat and was rescued. So it's now an artificial reef, and divers go down there, but it's a very powerful image that, of course, is for most of us invisible, only visible in photographs like this. And this is, of course, the established Italian artist Mimo Palladino, who created this gate that has sort of household items of migrants on it, and it's both welcoming, but it's also near Lampedusa's port, but also in a way clearly laying out the hardships that come with this ordeal. I wanted to move on to my two other projects. This is the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei, whom you know perhaps, and he went to Lampedusa and picked up hundreds of those life vests that migrants had left there. They are handed out. As you know, they often pay an enormous amount of money for someone who smuggles them onto a boat. They get a life vest, and he, in fact, put the life vests in the pond at Schönbrunn Castle in Vienna. Here you see it again, to basically undermine the serene beauty of this tourist attraction in Vienna, and give people a different idea of what really mattered at that particular moment. Ai Weiwei returned to that same idea in Berlin when the Karl Friedrich Schinkel's Schauspielhaus, many of you know this building at the heart of Berlin, and when this migrant crisis with thousands of people crossing and many hundreds, of course, dying in the process, in fact thousands dying in the process, was happening, he in fact changed the appearance of this famous building, one of the sort of most cherished examples of Schinkel's architecture in the center of Berlin, by cladding the columns with the life vests he had picked up. And I think it's such a powerful, strong image. Actually, maybe we can lower the light just behind you there, Carlotta, just a little bit, so it becomes a little stronger. I think yeah, perfect. So it's a very powerful image. It stayed for 2 weeks and then it's gone, but once you've seen this image, you can't really forget it. But that brings me to my last example, and this brings us to the city of Bari, and to the country across southern Italy, which is of course Albania, which struggled after the communist sort of empire folded, and there were enormous financial problems in Albania, and people were hungry and had no jobs and nowhere to go, and many tried to flee to Italy. And from Durrës, that you see here, which is sort of the harbor town of Tirana, to Bari on boats or whatever occasion they could, whatever sort of passage they could find. And one of the most harrowing episodes happened in August 1991. And here I just have a little bit of historical footage, which is so sort of drastic because it shows people at the beach, and then also footage of that boat that left, was sort of on the shore in Durrës, and people were trying to leave. The boat had just landed, it had an engine trouble, and there was a bit of a rumor that maybe there was a possibility of getting passports, and 20,000 Albanians in fact entered that boat and forced the captain to turn around and go back to Italy, hoping of course to escape the terrible hardship that they had encountered in Albania. And there's enormous, very dramatic footage that you can see here. I think I have another one where you see people climbing on board and trying to hold on to the ship. 20,000 on this ship with sort of one engine not working, and it moved all the way and arrived in the harbor of Bari. And that's when the drama really unfolded that I wanted to tell you about. There was a mayor, a professor who had become politician, which often happens in Italy, quite wonderful, and his name was Enrico Delfino. And he famously, he was very sympathetic to the plight of those migrants. And I'll stop here for a moment. The plight of these migrants, and he said, we have to help them. We have to do something for them. He said, they are people, desperate people. They cannot be sent back. We are their only hope. And the prime minister at the time, the president of the republic rather at the time, Francesco Cossiga, scolded him for that. And he said, and he was a hardliner, he said what a crétin he was. And the very kind-hearted Mayor Enrico Delfino left office shortly afterwards in December 1991 and died shortly afterwards. Many people feel he died from the stress of what this caused because he couldn't help those 20,000 people who were put into a sports stadium and then transported back under horrible conditions and then transported back pretty much, apart from a few who could escape, back to Albania. And so I had a chance to go to Bari, and I thought it was really interesting because I learned, and I'll tell you in a second from whom, but I learned about a work of art by a woman called Jasmine Pignatelli. And Jasmine Pignatelli wanted to create a memorial to this moment in August 8th, 1991, and she called it Sono Persone, they are people, and had the idea of translating that into Morse code. So it became, in a way, more abstract and in a way international. And you see here the Morse code, which reads, and I'll show you in a second, reads Sono Persone and the date there. And then, of course, the idea arose, and Jasmine managed to work it out to create a second memorial, which I'll show you in a moment on the other side. The memorial is, of course, facing the sea, but the taxi driver I asked to get me there had no idea, had never seen it before, and didn't know about it. But once you know about it and you see it, it's quite powerful. In fact, they changed the square of this housing project. They changed the name and called it Sono Persone, Piazza Sono Persone. And here it is in a sort of suburb of Bari. And then I took the boat and went across to Durres to see the other half of the memorial, which is right there in the harbor. Again, I took a taxi. He didn't know where we were going, and we finally found it. And it's just a bow of a ship with also a Morse code, which I thought was really interesting. But of course, the first one was Italian, the Morse code, Sono Persone. And you see here the Morse code, right? The S, every letter has a different set of dots or longer signs, as you can see here, and then the same words in the sort of language of Tirana, Albanian, Jane and Jeres. And you see that here, and I found a website where I can actually make it, turn it into Morse code. So let me see if I can play this for you. So here's the Italian version. Oh, it doesn't. Let me see. Maybe it's not that important, but you know, it sounds like beep, 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 but of course different. So let's see if that works. Otherwise, you can just hear it from my computer. Let's see. I don't know why it doesn't. Pardon? You want the beeps. Yes. I want the beeps, and they're not coming. Well, anyway, you know, it's not crucial. So obviously the beeping was a little different. You can beep it for yourself if you want, if you read that very quickly. So you get the idea. And I thought that was quite brilliant because it translated this into abstraction, into a work of art, and into an international language. And, you know, this brings me to Francesca, who is here tonight and who told me this whole story. And I was so moved by the story because it started with us. She's a professor at RISI, Francesca Leoni. She's from Bari, and we sat next to each other having lunch during a crit at RISI. And I said, oh, that's an interesting tattoo. What's this about? And she told me the story, and suddenly I realized that the fact that she put the Italian words sono persona in, which is of course addressing migrants everywhere and this sort of problem that we haven't mastered of global inequality that leads to migration and hardship. Sono persona, they're human beings. That she put this tattooed on her arm with that date was actually a work of art. It was sort of, she became suddenly a memorial and carried this around, and I'm sure I was not the first one who would ask you, right, about this tattoo, and I thought that was just an incredibly powerful moment where suddenly a memorial that was sort of ephemeral had become ubiquitous and could be anywhere, and I thought that's where public art can really make a difference, as in many of these examples that I've shown you. And Francesca is here, and I asked her to be here tonight to answer questions in the last row. But I wanted to end on that note by saying that I think public art and public humanities have a great future, and I hope you will all sort of support it as Brown figures out where to place the program, and hopefully come to events here at the center as once they have figured out the Institute for Advanced Studies here. So thank you very much. Maybe a question for Francesca, or for me, of course, as well. Yes?
I have a question for you, but now that you're not doing the program, I guess I was thinking about the future of your conversations. Last week, I was here for a very, shall we say, one-sided presentation about the former occupant of this house, apparently. And it was very full of personal narrative, full of insinuations and innuendos, and I was losing interest. And then suddenly things got very interesting when the granddaughter stood up and identified herself and challenged the presenter's viewpoint. And it reminded me that it would be very interesting, as I was coming over here, I was thinking, wouldn't it be interesting if she was presenting today? No offense, I mean, I'm glad you did, but I mean, if she was presenting today and answering some of, and I was thinking it could be a way to structure your future conversations, or even having two people come to the same presentation. Like, for example, there's an issue in East Providence, they're returning a golf course to the city. And there's people who want it to remain a green space, there's people who want it to be developed for business. And you could have people do a quick presentation and then having opposing viewpoints on something, and then have us ask them questions about it. And so I was just thinking it might be an interesting format for the future of these.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right, and I'm glad you pointed that out. It was, in a way, a historic moment, and of course you're surrounded actually by both Claire and Rada Watkins, who sits right behind you, who did the presentation. And, and of course, on the other side.
I love messy history. This is wonderful.
Wonderful, exactly.
Thank you.
I love it, and of course,
diagonally needed to happen.
Behind you is Vinnie Bornano, who acted in a way as sort of a mediator in this whole thing. And I think this is exactly what we hope public humanities can do, bring people together with different viewpoints and engage. And I think the way Sylvia and you engaged that night, I will never forget. I think
great.
It was exactly what needed to happen.
And
because Sylvia and I are the only authentic descendants of these two dogs. And it was a respectful conversation of a complicated history that had both sides in empathy.
Great.
And if it wasn't for you, my favorite troublemaker, Ben Bonanno, who understands how complicated the history of Benefit Street is, and you rose above it. And everybody of the one-sided conversation who came into this house really did last week. There were more brown people here last week than are here tonight. They felt respected and seen.
Absolutely.
And they appreciated the conversation with Sylvia. And thank you for putting Sylvia and I back together again.
Oh, I'm so happy about that.
And it was a conversation.
I saw you sitting right next to each other down there. I said, I think this is going along fine.
I'm so glad you came last week. Yes, to be continued. You and I should have a conversation. Hey, Dietrich, why don't you quit it? I'm sorry. Next series.
We'll see. Once, maybe Steve will organize events here. The students are thinking about a series of events, so you will be notified, of course. But I think it's a great format that in some way I hope will survive. And
Dietrich, you brought it to a fantastic level. I'm so proud to have you as a friend. And you've done this. I don't think anyone can do any better. I think we shouldn't rush over. It's sad to leave here. this is a wonderful venue to think about Rhode Island history and about the issues of human beings and persona. This is a perfect place for that kind of discussion. So let's hope Brown is wise enough to follow what you've shown.
Thank you, Vinny. Thank you. Oh, another question.
Can I ask you any other favorite public art in Providence or in Rhode Island? You mentioned, you showed the family memorial and the mural downtown. I was curious if there's anything else of note.
Oh yes, many. I love many of the murals, and one of the many things I'm grateful for is our collaboration with lots of organizations. Among them, the Avenue Concept, that has put most of them up, and I love the one right here with the enormous mural with Princess Red Wing, and I love the one off Washington Street with it's called She Didn't Come, something like that, So I think that's very rich and wonderful. Yeah, no, so it's endless there. It's amazing art here, and it's a great city to encounter art. I think it's very strong here. Yeah. So if there are no other questions, then my usual invitation to go into the next room, join us for wine and food, and continue the conversation there. So once again, thank you very much. Yeah.
Is this your last night directing this?
Yes, that was the last conversation for the foreseeable
And
future.
so there's second semester, there's no expectation of continuing here. We'll start.
I asked the students, they're thinking about doing some sort of salon maybe, but it's still being worked out. And I said we would, obviously they have our mailing list, and I hope they will reach out once they have figured something out and figured out their focus audience, etc. But Julia is here, she might know more, and so we'll see. I think Steve will have other events that he'll organize. Thank you. All right, thank you all.